Hey KBC, welcome back to Daniel's side of the story where I just go through that week's chapter of the story and I just share a few of my thoughts and some of my reflections that I had when I read through. Just kind of to help get some conversation going in our small groups and our families and just for your own personal sake of reflection on the scripture that we're reading through each and every week as a church family. This week, we've been going through chapter 18 of the story, and we're taking a look at a few people who are living in exile. Now, this is important as I begin. I want to make sure that you know we may be talking about Daniel in exile, and while I may be in Moncton away from my KBC family physically, we're looking at a different Daniel today. So we won't take a look at my experiences living in exile in Moncton. All right. All joking aside, as I read through this chapter, there was a lot that stuck out to me, and a lot of different places in Scripture elsewhere that I was reminded of as I read through this. So I'm really excited to take a look at that. So let's jump right into it. The number one thing that really stuck out to me as I read through this chapter is how these men responded to the ways of the world. And here's what I mean by that. Time and time again, Daniel and friends, as I'll call them, Daniel and friends found themselves in situations where they are in some form of opposition, where God and His way is one option, versus the way of the world, the way of King Nebuchadnezzar or the Babylonians. And they need to figure out how they're going to act, which way are they going to follow. And throughout the story, Daniel and friends consistently make the right choices, and God honors them for it. It says just at the beginning of the book of Daniel and the beginning of this chapter that they were blessed physically, they were blessed mentally, and they were given wisdom. Daniel was even able to interpret dreams. God blesses these people. And very quickly, it seems, they rise through the ranks in the Babylonian government as officials and advisors. They're people that the king learns to trust. He learns to trust their judgment, and he recognizes that there's something different about these men. And yet, despite all the blessings that they have, they're also faced with some ridiculously imposing forces of opposition. It's like time and time again, there's just this great wall, this barrier that they have to overcome. And it starts with the little things, too. Did you notice that? It starts out with eating the king's food. Now, for us today, that seems like a bit of a bizarre situation, don't eat the king's food. But these dietary laws were a really serious thing for Daniel and the rest of the people of Judah and Israel. And they were given this food that they were commanded by God not to eat. So what kind of options do we have here? Well, you could just let it slide, we're in exile. God didn't deliver us from the Babylonians anyway. Maybe I'll just eat the food. But that's not what they did. They stayed true to God's commands, these four men. And yet they also handle the situation with respect and with wisdom. They don't just say, oh no, that's not something I can do, shame on you for trying to make me do this. They handled the situation really well. I encourage you to think about how they responded to the supervisor that they had who was responsible. They said, hey, can you give us this option instead? Can we go with this? And they really try to work things out with a lot of wisdom and grace. And in the end, the advisor respects them for it. And God blesses their obedience above all. And yet we also see that there was a greater opposition that also comes after that. It starts with the little things, but by the end of the story, there's some massive opposition and a lot of temptation, no doubt, to just give up and follow the way of the world. Suddenly, these men are faced with just ridiculous, crazy opposition, right? There's a mass execution order from an angry king for all of his advisors and officials because he couldn't interpret a dream. We have fiery furnaces, and we have lions' dens filled with starved lions ready to eat anything that were to be thrown in. There's one thing after another, and it leads to sure death situations that these men face in opposition. And as I read through these stories, I was reminded also of the story of Joseph, a story that I have already said how much I love. But I was reminded of the story of Joseph, who was another guy who, overall, he was faithful to God, and he was blessed by God. And yet he also still ended up, time and time again, in one bad situation after another. Whether he was betrayed by his brothers, whether he was sold as a slave, when he was thrown in prison. It was one thing after another, and it seemed like as soon as they get a leg up, they fall back down again. All of these guys, Joseph and Daniel and his friends, they all end up on high mountains, blessed by God. They're on top of the world, and then they're thrown down to the deepest valley around, time and time again. But here's the amazing thing about Daniel and friends, right? Each time that they're faced with a difficult choice, they choose to remain faithful to God. They trust in His provision, and they bring their situation to Him first. The first instinct that these guys have seemed to be prayer. Bring God all of these situations. Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar that only God can reveal the mystery of dreams. It's not by his own power. It's God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they tell the king this. They say, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. He will deliver us from your majesty's hand, but even if he doesn't, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. You can read that on page 255. These guys are seriously faithful to God. They follow his commands, and yet they still end up in heaps of trouble time and time again. And that's the number one takeaway that I got from the chapter. Following God, obeying his commands, that doesn't mean that we're going to have an easy life. These guys were all blessed, absolutely. They were blessed with some amazing things. They had so much success as well, all of them. And yet they faced all this tremendous opposition because of their faith. And let's look ahead in the scripture. John 10:10, Jesus says that the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly. It's also written in Matthew 10:39 that whoever finds his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And that's the amazing thing. Jesus doesn't promise an easy life. In fact, he promises that there's going to be suffering and there's going to be opposition. But he also says that obedience in him will lead to an abundant life. We haven't been promised an easy life, but we've been promised a good life through Jesus. A life that is full. And that's the thing, right? We've all been called to obedience. And we have to make that choice to listen and obey, to be obedient, regardless of what difficulties might rise up. And I know that being faithful to God, even if it means facing hardship, will always be greater than choosing the way of the world. Hey, thanks for listening today. That's my takeaway for the story of Daniel and friends in exile. I hope that this gets you thinking about how God's working throughout the story of Scripture and how he might be moving in your own life as well. What are some oppositions that you need to stand up and say, I will follow God? Till next time, thanks for listening, and bye for now.